I am Dr. Robert E. Hampson. Dr. Rob, also known as Speaker, because foolishly I came up with a signature line that's called me the Speaker to Lab Animals many, many years ago, and somehow the shortened form of Speaker just kind of stuck. But I'm a neuroscientist. I have 41 years in scientific research in the neurosciences, and before that, I did research in aquatic biology, microbiology, biology, chemistry, organic, all of those different things I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I'm still working on that one because what I wanted to be when I grew up was a writer and an astronaut, and they didn't all quite fit together. I am here as a subject matter expert. I'm also a young writer, so I'm here learning as much as I am talking about the work. But I was asked to talk on a subject called Neuro Follies, and it's incorporating realistic brain science into your stories. We've already had a question to the audience, and those of you who answered before need to be quiet, and I'll pick somebody else and see who else comes up with the right answer. What percentage of our brain do we use at a time?
98.
98? You get a brain.
Okay.
So it's really 100%. The entirety of the brain is active at any given time. We're just not paying attention to it. You go out there in that hallway, and it is an absolute din of noise. Somebody calls your name. You're looking at it. You hear it. Whether or not you were paying attention, you hear somebody call your name. That's because your brain is constantly processing. You have to ignore it most of the time. You do not pay attention to the sensation of button a chair until something starts to hurt. You don't pay attention to the movement of air across your skin until it's too hot or it's too cold. So your brain is active, processing all of this information at the same time. You're just not paying attention to it. And what happens is because there are misconceptions like we only use 10% of our brain at a time. I'm sorry, Morgan Freeman's explanation should have been totally different in Lucy. He should have been saying, "You fools, you know it's all the time. This doesn't work. The movie's over. There's no story. Sorry." But the idea is that there are tropes that literature falls into with respect to the brain, and I'm hoping to elevate y'all a little bit to thinking about new things, because the brain's exciting. Frankly, as I said, I've been doing this for 41 years. It's still exciting. There are still things to do, still things to learn. I learned lately that a group has taken a culture of neurons and taught it to play Pong. So my new boss has said, what else can we do with that idea? And so I don't know, maybe we're going to build organic computers. It's an interesting thing. So basic outline, I have slides, and the slides will get incorporated into the video from this session. So when it gets posted, there will be some slide material up in the corner. So I'll spend about 10 minutes talking about what the brain is, about 10 minutes on what the brain does, how we use it, and then we'll go into brain follies and some Q&A. And I really want to leave enough time for some good Q&A with all of this. So the basics, I want to tell you about, and again, I'm doing this mostly so that Logan's got the visual cue of when to put the slides in. We're going to talk about the parts of the brain. We're going to talk about neurons and axons. We're going to talk about the brain function. So I had this wonderful set of pictures up here that I was going to project and show you what the different parts of the brain are. Since you can't all see that, we're going to go with my fallback. Take your fist, thumb down, palm away from you, curl. All right. Your wrist is what we call the occipital lobe. The back of your hand is the parietal lobe. Your knuckles are right the junction between the parietal and the frontal lobe. So your four knuckles here, that's your frontal lobe. The thumb is your temporal lobe. And coming out of the back here, we have some other structures, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and everything like that. Now, this thing about these knuckles right here, this is very important, because this now gets us into a question of what do the different brain areas do. Back here at the occipital lobe, that's vision. The signals from your retinas come in and start getting built up from points to lines to shapes to everything else like that. So this whole parietal section is all designed and functions to put sensory information together. Vision is light, dark, colors, dots, lines, and then we put it together from there. Hearing, audition, is frequencies, low, high, and everything in between. Stuff we can hear, stuff we can't hear. So hearing is here, vision is here. Right here on the back of the hand side of these knuckles is what we call the sensory cortex. That is where the map of your body is. That includes everything else: pressure, touch, heat, cold, pain. All of that is represented here. Right in front of these knuckles is what we call the motor strip. And that's where all the signals are, a very similar map of the body, moving our arms, wiggling our noses or ears or whatever. My wife can wiggle her toes. I can't wiggle my toes. But all of that control is sitting there in the motor strip. In front of that, the prefrontal or frontal areas, that's basically where conscious thought is. We call it executive function. And that's where you make decisions. That's where you assess risk and the like. Down here, the thumb, the temporal lobe, that's where memory and emotion are processed. It's not where they're stored, it's where they're processed. So that's very important. And again, there are other connections, and when we get the slides up, we'll be able to show you that. Now, as far as how the brain functions, I like to tell people that the brain is steampunk, okay? So what's steampunk? Steam, pressure, valves, clockwork, and electricity, usually lightning bolts, right? So what we have are various structures that build up to the brain. The individual brain cells are called neurons, and neurons are chemical and electrical factories. They use chemicals to send signals between neurons, and they use electricity to send signals within a neuron. I'm going to keep this to the most simple part, is that you know that, or hopefully know that we have what are called ions. These are molecules that are charged. We need lots of negative ion out there in the hallway to get rid of the smoke, because that's what it would do. It's one of its functions. Well, in the body, the negative and the positive ions are separated in the neurons. Positive on the outside, negative on the inside, because when we open a channel that allows the positive and negative to flow freely, we get something that looks a whole lot like a battery. And so the way we keep that battery charged is with something like clockwork. So we actually have proteins, molecules in the membrane exterior of a neuron that work like clockwork, doing this all the time, pushing potassium, positive charge, out, and chloride, I should say, sodium and potassium out, chloride in, giving us positive out, negative in. When we're ready to activate a neuron, we open up a channel that lets that sodium flow. Now, what happens is, because positive ions coming in, it changes the electrical state of the neuron, and that state can flow. And it's a one-way flow, and there's physics involved, so we're not going to go into that. You don't have to roll a sanity check for this type of physics. But what the one-way flow means that the electrical signal will flow from the body of a neuron down an axon. Second part of our setup is the axons. Axons can be very, very short. They can go from one brain area to another. They can go from one cell to another. Or they can go all the way from here to the base of my spine, make a junction, make a connection, and then go all the way down to my toes. And in the squid, one of the things we do in the laboratory is we work with something called the squid giant axon. The squid giant axon is about that big around, and and in the wild, in the actual squid, it can be several feet long. And this is one of the things that neuroscientists have done to figure out how all of this works. But the other part that we have is that we have what are called nerves. I haven't mentioned nerves up to this point, right? Nerves are bundles of axons. They are not the brain cells, the neurons themselves. They're just the axons. And you take a whole bunch of them all going in the same direction, bundle them together, and call that a nerve. Now, what a nerve could be is one place on the cortex, the motor area that controls your fingers. You can have a nerve heading down here and then send branches off. And there's also lots and lots of redundancy in the nervous system as well. So our basic structure, neurons, axon, nerves, and by the way, the electrical potential, that's steam. The valves, the receptors that we open or close in order to activate a neuron, that's just like the valves in a steam engine. And then the clockwork, which makes it all, that pumps everything back and forth, sets it all up in the first place. That's our clockwork. And then, of course, that electrical potential, that's lightning, which is one of the reasons why I tell everybody that, your brain is steampunk. It's a really easy way to remember what the different functions are and how they work. I have some more figures here, and Logan can incorporate those as we go that talk about some of the various functions and annotations, which we're not going to go into right now. But we're going to talk about the brain functions, the areas of the brain. Now, I've given you most of it by talking about using the hand model, or using our little model right here. So the part that most people are going to think about with the brain are the sensory strip and the motor strip. The sensory strip collects information from all over the body and represents it in a map. We call this either a topographical map or a homunculus. The homunculus mainly because it turns out that the representation where the nerves from particular parts of the body end up on the cortex of the brain are mapped in the exact same shape and structure as the body is. And then the muscles in the motor strip are in roughly the same location as that homunculus. Thank you. So so now what we have is, okay, but where do the various senses come in? That talks about the body. But in our body senses are heat, cold, pressure, or lack thereof, position. When you move your arms, there are signals that tell the brain what angle this joint is at, and whether it's elevated or down, whether you have to flex or extend, all of these different functions. So that's just the motor strip. But vision goes into a very special place. Back of the brain, the occipital. And again, the initial map is right side of the visual field, left side of the visual field. Dots, lines with different orientation. And we've actually learned that there are columns in the brain in that area which you can go and you can map exactly what all of these shapes and functions are. Now, moving forward from that, as you get now into this parietal area, we have what we call association cortex. The association cortex is where you start putting things together like brown and jacket, okay? So your blazer here, or burgundy and, I'm sorry, yellow and line, all right? or black and circle. That's what happens at association cortex. As you get higher and higher, we actually know that there are places in the brain that respond to specific faces and specific images. We jokingly, when I was a young neuroscience whippersnapper, we would call those grandmother cells and joke and laugh until we found out they actually existed. And when it comes to our auditory senses, we also have a feed into that same association cortex here in the parietal lobe. Our sense of smell and our sense of taste are not as well represented, but they also feed into it. That area is actually right up under there, so it's kind of hard to get to. So in your thumb model, it's right in there. Okay. So, and then, okay, what are our other senses? We've taken care of the touch, vision, auditory is right here, taste and smell are up here. What else have we got? Proprioception, that's going to be back here. And what about what we think about it, or how we plan what we're going to do? That's going to be up here in this prefrontal area that we refer to. And one of the things we know is that damage, someone takes a hit right there, it will change their personality, it will change their ability to make decisions, it will change their ability to assess risks. And these are all different functions. We also have some specialized areas. So right here, just forward of the motor area, but as part of this frontal decision making, we have Broca's area for speech. Okay, sitting right here. And it's right next to the mouth, tongue areas of the motor strip. That makes sense, right? That's what it's got to control. And it's sitting in the frontal areas where we have what we consider conscious thought. So all of that makes sense. The thing that doesn't make sense is, why is it only over here and not over here? Well, the answer to that is it doesn't have to be. Part of my research work takes me into the epilepsy monitoring unit. I work with patients who have epilepsy. And recently, we worked with a patient whose speech center was on the right side and not on the left. The other really specialized area we have is just right at the junction of vision and hearing in the sensory area, and it's called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is back here, just above the ear, if you're doing this on the skull. And Wernicke's area is very useful to language. So reading and understanding what you read, hearing and understanding what you hear, that's all part of Wernicke's. Now, if you want to respond to it, you need to invoke Broca's. And the two of them are connected. And what's really strange is there are two connections between Wernicke's and Broca's. The surface one is the one that is generally involved in speech. There's a lower one called the arcuate fasciculus. There will not be a quiz later, so you don't have to worry about that one. But the arcuate fasciculus is involved in music. And as we talk about the follies and the different things that are true or not true in what we generally know, one of the things we know that a stroke or a head injury can cause is aphasia, the inability to speak. Sometimes it's just the inability to come up with certain words. It can also be the inability to speak. Music sense is intact. A lot of stroke patients can sing. And when they can't speak, sometimes they can sing their intent. So that's one of your first neuro tips here is that if you want to do something interesting with a character, give them an aphasia due to a head injury and have them sing instead of speak. The other thing is that all these brain areas talk to each other at a given time. Back to this whole idea of it's not just 10%, but the brain areas all talk to each other at the same time. And different functions can be seen in terms of what a network of areas of the brain that are active. And so I have a figure. Again, you'll need to see the slides when we post them or the video when we post it to see this. But there is what's called a default mode network. We're sitting here. If you're just sitting listening, your default mode network is operating. Really, if you're actually, and if anybody's just sitting and they're zoned out, yeah, that's a default mode network. If you're speaking, you have a task mode network. If you're reading, if you're writing, if you're composing, and frankly, every one of us that's a writer that goes into the writer fugue, we've got a lot going on. And it's going to be Wernicke's area, and it's going to be all the motor areas for the writing or typing or anything we're doing. It's going to be a lot of frontal areas because we're contemplating our characters and we're trying to figure out. And believe it or not, you may find auditory areas lighting up if you're one of those people who says, my characters are talking to me, okay? And the appropriate brain area will actually function and show up. So we have these different networks. And so much of what we do with the brain is based on these networks. What network is active at any given time? And if you break one of those networks, then you have trouble doing that function. So I got a section here on fooling the brain and showing a person wearing augmented reality goggles, because that's actually one of the ways we can fool the brain by giving it information that it doesn't necessarily have. But again, sensory information is crude. It's coarse. Points, lines, basic shapes, colors, sound frequencies, location inside the body or outside the body, left to you, right to me, and vice versa. And by the way, if you've ever wondered why an X-ray is backward, it's because the X-ray is meant to be read by the doctor who's looking at you. And so he's looking at something that says, left, and it's on the right side because he's looking at you, and he's looking, and your left is on his right or her right. And so that's, so these are positions, and these are all the basic information. Somatic sensation, hot, cold, pressure, position on the skin, location on the skin. The brain takes partial information. The brain seldom has complete information. It takes partial information and fills it in, and that is where the brain gets fooled. Optical and auditory illusions and hallucinations are caused when the partial information is incorrectly filled in. We also can have neuropathic sensations. Does anybody know what phantom limb is? Yes.
When someone misses a limb and then feel it like it's itching or something, but it's not there.
Right.
It's just like,
And why is and why do we know why that is? So you get one. And the one with your hand up back there. This is like a stadium, It's the
T-shirt can.
You make
Yeah.
extra points if you hit him in the head.
No, I'm not going to do that. So why would we have phantom limb? Because your brain is still active in those areas even when you don't have a limb there. Great, thank you. So we have neuropathic sensation in which the nerves are firing off, even though there's no stimulus causing it to fire. We can also have something called neglect. This is tip number 2. You want something more interesting to have your character go through, give them a head injury that causes a neglect. If it's in the visual parts of the brain or the processing parts of the brain, you can actually have patients who can perfectly see and react. You can throw a squishy brain at them, and they'll be able to catch it or at least deflect it. But you ask them what's in this half of their visual area, and they cannot tell you. They're neglecting it. Their brain has a breakdown in communication between the what is there and the knowledge of what is there. And that, again, these are the networks. The sensory information comes in and is processed in the back, but our conscious knowledge is what's being processed up here in the front. Again, the summary is the brain's made up of neurons. The neurons are a chemical and electrical function. We have input and output projections from the brain through the nerves that serve the rest of the body, and we have networks within the brain that do most of the functions. So that takes us into our common follies. We've already talked about the first one, 10% of the brain. Nope, no, all the brain all the time. You're just not paying attention to it. Okay, this one's my favorite. I call it soap opera amnesia. What happens when a person in a soap opera has a box fall on their head? Boop. 7 years of total amnesia. And what happens when, boop, hit them on the head again? It all comes back.
We call that the Fred Flintstone.
Okay. It's and I've always referred to it. It's either the soap opera or the telenovela, because it's so common, or the Hallmark movie. I can list several Hallmark Christmas movies that in which that happens. So the idea is that that's not going to cause amnesia. This is going to cause amnesia, okay? Because memory is processed here. By the way, you're not losing the memory. Memory is association. Memory is, okay, I'm sitting in a room, it's a little cool, there's still this faint hint of cigarette smoke in the air, and there are 2 people in the room wearing pink chef hats. Okay? That's association. And what happens with amnesia is we lose the ability to link the association with the actual memory of what was said in this talk. Okay? We have a context. We just don't have all of the content.
And that's the temporal mode, or is that?
It's largely temporal, is because the major function, there's a structure there called the hippocampus, of which I've spent way too much of my life studying. And the hippocampus is the one that links a code to the information, a retrieval code, a context code to the information. One of our other follies, all head injuries are fatal. Or all head injuries can just be shrugged off if you've got a hard enough head. I know a gentleman who was injured in Afghanistan, and he took a rifle bullet, went in just above his ear, came out just beside his nose. That would be considered a major head injury. That should have been fatal. And he does have a persistent problem with migraines and headaches, but he's perfectly functional. It did not affect his language. It did not affect his consciousness. He walked off the helicopter when he got injured. Wow. And there is a famous case. Has anybody heard of Phineas Gage? All right. You got one, did you? No? All right. So who's Phineas Gage?
He was building railway tracks.
Right.
Gunpowder or whatever they used.
Yep.
To do the explosives, and normally meant to pack it a certain way and then write the lead or whatever it is, and he hadn't packed it down properly, hit it, and had something massive and spiky go through his head.
Right. So he's working with a 6-foot iron tamping rod, and the explosive had to be packed into the holes to make sure they got a controlled explosion. And for some reason, he was distracted. We don't know all the details. He goes boom. He tamps it. It goes boom. And it comes up, and it went right through there and obliterated 1/2 of his frontal lobe. Now, this is not the case of this friend of mine, in which the bullet pretty much skimmed on the inside of the skull. This is actually went right through and obliterated a large chunk of his frontal lobe. He walked away from the accident. And there are 2 conflicting stories of what happened to Phineas Gage. One is that he had a total personality change from a very controlled, civilized, precise worker, because he had a very dangerous job, and then he had to be precise in his work to prevent injury, and of course he did get injured anyway. And he became rough, crude, unable to hold a job because he had a personality change from the damage. Well, that is in the historic record of how he responded immediately after the injury. There is a report that he couldn't work in the U.S. and he went to South America, at which point he was a drover. He drove, horse-drawn wagon teams. And drovers would run teams of 6, 8, 10 horses, and they would control each horse by having one lead wrapped around each finger, and they would be doing this. And that's how they controlled the teams on mountain pathways, on mountain roads that were quite narrow and quite treacherous. And Phineas Gage was doing this. This is not the mark of a person who has just become rude, crude, unable to keep a job. So he did recover. He did apparently have a lot of good brain function after that. The immediate effects were, in fact, to change his personality. And we know now that a lot of that is swelling in the brain. So brain injuries don't have to be fatal. They can have profound consequences. And the profound consequences, the most lingering one that would be useful for a story character is somebody who's always got headaches or migraines. Someone who has had an aphasia, someone who does have some form of amnesia, and they can have personality changes. They can have stroke-like symptoms as well, where they lose control part of the body. One of the next follies is the brain doesn't regenerate. We're born with all the cells that we're ever going to have, which is not true. As a matter of fact, we're born with about 20% more cells than what we're going to have as adults, and we lose most of that extra 20% in the first 6 months of life because the brain overgrows and then prunes back. And there are many parts of the brain that actually continue to grow new cells and replace the old ones. Now, one of the newest things that we're starting to see in neuroscience having to do with aging is something called senescent cells. Senescent cells are cells that have just said, I'm tired, I'm not going to work anymore. And they just stop. But they're still metabolically active, and you can't kill them. They don't die the way they're supposed to. Because a cell that stops working is supposed to die, and these cells don't. They just sort of retire in place. So, but the brain does regenerate to a little bit. You can replace cells. You're not going to regrow a whole lobe or anything like that, but you're going to get these little pieces. Another folly is Alzheimer's disease and senility are the same thing. No. Alzheimer's disease is characterized by losing the part of the brain that processes new memory. And what we are now finding is that what really happens is, remember I said how everything's a network? It's the network that breaks down and doesn't function the way it should. So for the past 10 years, I've been working on ways to fix that. As part of my research, that has kind of, we were thinking in terms of something like a pacemaker for the brain, and there are deep brain stimulators that are used as a pacemaker-like function for Parkinson's disease and for the movement disorders. We were looking at it for memory disorders, and it's still out there somewhere, but I just changed departments, and now we're going to look and see if we can regrow it instead. So loss of oxygen is the most important factor in brain damage. We must restore oxygen delivery as much and as fast as possible. The biggest problem is that if you restore oxygen to oxygen-starved brain cells, the metabolic products that have built up during that period of time in which you don't have oxygen are toxic to the cells. So if you restore oxygen and those cells get active again, without having the blood flow to take away the toxins, you get more damage. So as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why hypercooling, chilling, is used in brain surgery and the like is because you don't want the brain cells to come back to full activity at the same time. Same way you treat frostbite. You don't just warm up the frostbitten limb because then you're going to kill the skin cells, the surface cells. You got to get the blood circulation going first. Oh, here's one of my favorites. Epileptic seizures. They all look like the movies. The patient falls down and starts. You know what does anybody know what the most common epileptic seizure is?
Frozen,
Yeah, you said frozen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And just for good measure, the most common epileptic seizure is what we call absence. And that person just goes, where have we seen that lately?
Someone in the Congress.
We had a senator freeze in the middle of a speech. And there is speculation that what happened was either a transient ischemic attack, a mini stroke, or an absence seizure. And of course, nobody's going to tell us.
How do you spell that?
Absence?
Yeah.
Absence.
Okay.
It's spelled absence and pronounced French. You know, actually I think it came out of German instead of French. But that's so many of the great brain scientists of the the 19th and early 20th century came out of Germany. Okay, I'm going to skip one here so we get to question and answer. Schizophrenia is the same as split personality. No. Schizophrenia means divided mind, okay? What that means is your brain is telling you two different things. You know what appropriate behavior is. You're going to do this other thing anyway. And so multiple personality is actually considered a psychosis. Schizophrenia is a neurosis. It's biological. And actually what we know is you've got an imbalance of those chemicals that are used to activate the neurons or that are used to bridge the gap between an axon and the next neuron. And so schizophrenia is definitely one of those things that is so often misappropriated or misreferenced. So Q&A. I want to get some Q&A before we finish up. So yes.
When we're looking at memory loss, whether it's due to traumatic injury or aging or any of that, I was curious what we're looking at in relation to various other mental abilities like ADHD, which is actually a loss of short-term memory doesn't work. So are they doing any research in that area?
Well, the issue with ADHD is not so much that the short-term memory doesn't work. It's just actually what we have the short-term memory is too strong. It can't be erased. So that what you have is you do have an imbalance in how the memory is processed. The hyper-focus means that, okay, I'm paying attention to this, and this is what I want to do. Thanks. And I don't want to let go of it to do something else. But when we see memory loss, for the most part, we have two stages. We have an early stage of Alzheimer's disease and senility, in which we lose the association ability, and then we have a late stage in which we actually lose the connections and the cells that are supporting it. So those are the two things we've got. I want to try to get as many of these as possible. Go ahead, yes?
Can you talk a bit about the evolution of the brain, and in particular the two halves of the human brain differentiating?
The whole idea that we are dominated by left brain, right brain functions is pretty much not true. The right side is not our creative side. The left side is not our analytical side. The thing about it is the major reason why we have developed a bicameral brain, two halves, has to do with more efficient control of half of the body. And the interesting thing, of course, that this half of the brain controls this half of the body. And it all ties back to what we see with our vision. Because this part of the brain, this part of the retina on both sides, is seeing that side of the world. So this is the side it controls. And that's, but we know that bicameral brains with two halves goes all the way through almost virtually all of the mammalian species, if not all the mammalian species. One of the things that people talk about and ask me about is the folds on the brain. And the reason why our brains are folded is because that was the best way to pack more into a constrained space. Dolphins who don't have so much of a constraint have very, very smooth brains. They have some folds, not as much, but see, their heads can grow to be larger to accommodate all that extra space.
And the role of the corpus callosum?
The corpus callosum is how we coordinate the information between the two halves, which is one of the reasons why we don't really divide the functions. Now, I can't really speak to why Wernicke's and Broca's are only on the left side, other than to say that is a developmental issue, and if there is some reason why the left side of the brain is less functional during development, then speech and language will lateralize to the right side. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I've got a few, and they're sort of right.
Well, let's do one, and so I can grab them.
Can I? Oh, which one? You said the speech can go with an aphasia from a head injury.
Right.
Did you say stroke as well? Can they?
Stroke,
do
yes.
Strokes have the singing as well. So stroke
Yes, as do migraines that cause aphasia. I have a friend who drops his voice into his singing register, and he sings as if he's doing a Gregorian chant, and he can sing and he can talk when a migraine would otherwise leave him speechless.
Wild.
Yeah, isn't that neat? Yeah. Okay, something from a little further back, and then I'll come back to you. Yes.
People report that listening to music while they do things is a useful thing. Writers do it all the time.
Yeah,
Music.
right.
Is that real, and if so, why? What's going on there?
Well, the music in the brain is a fascinating field. If anybody's interested, I suggest you look up Donald Humphreys, Humphrys, and Jonathan Burdette, Burdettete, who've done a major study on music in the brain. And one of the neat things is that you listen to music and you activate a similar array of brain areas as if you were reading, okay? If you take a musician and you have them listen to music, you see even more areas light up, especially if what they're listening to is the instrument they play. You take a symphony conductor and you will see the motor cortex light up. You'll see Wernicke's areas light up with language. You'll see all of the auditory, all of the frontal areas, because they are conducting that symphony in their head while they're while they're just reading. They're not listening, they're reading a score. And so one of the reasons why music is good, number one, music blots out. Remember, you're picking up the sensation for everything, you're just not paying attention to it. Music is really good at covering the background noise, okay? And the other thing is it's stimulating the active networks in the brain, which are very useful when you're writing. We're out of town, that too. So what I would like to recommend is I have a website, rehampson.com. So really easy, rehampson.com. At that website, you can find my science essays. You can find links to my science fiction. I write what I know, so I wrote A Bionic Man. And I will try and put up some links from this. You'll also see some of the press releases from the research work I've done as well. So rehampson.com. Thanks for coming out.